We will have the conversations that few are prepared to have, and more importantly, conversations centered on rationality. Subscribe now to listen to Rational Voices with Sunil. Today we have Helen Joyce. I don't think there's fewer people who have had a more profound impact when it comes to defending women's rights in the last few years. Helen, first of all, we're coming straight off the back of the incredible result from 2 days ago, or even yesterday. What has your reaction been? What's it been like for you, just coming across with the Supreme Court ruling?
Okay, I'll start by giving your listeners just a brief trot through what the case was about. It was taken by a group of Scottish grassroots campaigners called For Women Scotland, and it was taken against the government in Scotland, but they have taken successive legal challenges and it ended up in the Supreme Court, which heard their case last November. And it looked like it was on a very technical matter, which is the question of public boards and quotas in Scotland. The Scottish Government wanted to use a measure called positive action, which allowed them to say that more than half of the members of a board of a public body would have to be women. But the question was, how are they going to define the word woman? And first they had tried to define it as being anyone who defined themselves as a woman. But in England and in the UK and in Scotland, the law is not gender self-ID. Woman actually has a meaning, and it's not just what you say you are. So For Women Scotland won that first case. And then the Scottish Government went away and it changed its rules, and it came back saying that a woman was anyone who had a piece of paper saying that they were a woman. So either a birth certificate or a thing called a gender recognition certificate that you've been able to get since 2004 if you have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria and you fill some other conditions. So some men are legally women for some legal purposes, and the Scottish Government was saying it was including them in this positive action measure. And For Women Scotland challenged that again, and in fact they lost in a Scottish court, and they appealed, and it ended up at the Supreme Court. And because of the way equality law works in the UK, that tiny definition that was to do with quotas actually leveraged out right across the whole of the Equality Act, which is the law that combines within it all the anti-discrimination equality law, including sex discrimination, also race discrimination, belief discrimination and other things. And also right across the three nations on the island of Britain, Wales, England and Scotland. So this little thing became a sort of a lever to fix, after years of people disagreeing about it and controversy, what woman and female and man and male mean in the whole of the Equality Act. So I work for an organisation called Sex Matters. It's a small human rights charity that has only been in existence for a few years, and we are concerned with stabilising and clarifying the meaning of sex in law and everyday life, and to give it the biological meaning, so that man and woman actually mean really your biology, the thing that you were born, not the thing that it says on your paperwork, no matter how you got that paperwork. So we sought leave to appeal, So we sought leave to intervene in this case, and we got it, and we were very proud as such a small and young charity to be invited not just to intervene, but to give an hours of oral submission as well. And we did that last November. And then fast forward to last Wednesday, and the Supreme Court read out the short version of its judgment at about 10 o'clock in the morning. And we had no foresight of what it was. Nobody did, not our lawyers, not the Scottish Government, not anybody else. The judges didn't tell anybody. So we had to file in and sit there and listen while they told us what the words woman, man, male and female mean in one of the most important laws in the UK. And we'd been warned beforehand that we were not to make any noise, that it was a courtroom. So we all had to be very well behaved. I saw video afterwards of what happened at the watch party in Edinburgh that For Women Scotland had arranged. And when the judges said that woman and man and male and female took their biological meaning in the courtroom, there was a very polite inhale from about 70 women, well, some men as well, but mostly women, like that. In Edinburgh, there was an eruption with about 200 women standing up and screaming and crying and jumping up and down, and then breaking into a chorus of it's a Scottish song that they've rewritten the words to, so that it's about, women's rights will not be forgotten, will not be overlooked. It's one of the most emotional things I've ever done in my life, and I'm still reeling from it slightly.
What was that all like? Because you've been involved in this for such a long time, and we'll go into your sort of history background. But what was that feeling like when you heard the result from the judge? What was, yeah, your personal feeling on it?
Oh, it was so emotional. Because we had intervened, there were seats kept for us in the courtroom. There were three groups. No, there were three groups on our side, and then essentially three groups on the other side. So for Women Scotland, obviously, were there. Well, they left one of them in Edinburgh to run the party, and two of them came down here. Their lawyer was with them, Cindy. Then we were there with various of our staff members, our legal team, but not our barrister because he was away. And then there was a third group intervening on our side, which got to be called the Lesbian Interveners. It was three different organisations who represent the interests of lesbians, because if you destabilise the meaning of sex, you destabilise the meaning of sexual orientation.
Right.
And if what man and woman mean is paperwork, then that's true for lesbian as well. So they made very powerful submissions that the way that the law was being interpreted by the Scottish Government meant that lesbians couldn't meet in associations without allowing in heterosexual men who have pieces of paper saying they're women, which is obviously a gross attack on lesbians' freedom of association and rights. So they had representatives there as well. And then on the other side, there was the Scottish Government. I don't know who they had there. Amazingly, Amnesty, the well-known human rights charity, intervened on the side of the Scottish Government to argue that lesbians shouldn't be allowed to meet without men. And so, incredibly, did the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is the national regulator that oversees equality law. And their position wasn't that this was a good law or that this was the right law. Their position was just that this is the law, unfortunately, because the Gender Recognition Act and the Equality Act interact with each other in a way that they felt that they did interact with each other, and they felt that that was very undesirable, but they also felt it was true. So we were given badges that said lawyer. And obviously I'm not a lawyer, but they only have badges that say lawyer, apparently, like if you are somebody who has a booked seat. So I filed into a room in the Supreme Court, and there was my name on a piece of paper on a front row seat, in fact. And I wore my badge saying lawyer, and then other people, members of the public, could come in too. They filled the courtroom, and I think there was an overflow room as well, where you can sit and watch via video link. And it was actually broadcast as well, I think on a 10-second delay. And I had really braced myself for us losing, I have to say. And I was okay with that. Yeah, no, I was sort of 60-40 that we probably would lose, whereas I think a lot of my colleagues were 60-40 or 70-30 that we would win. And I was okay either way. We did some big game planning beforehand and scenario planning. And we concluded that along the way, some of the things that For Women Scotland had managed to establish were already extremely valuable. So, for example, they had managed to establish that gender self-ID, that just saying you're a woman definitely is not the law in this country. So that was going to be in the judgment for sure. And that's already a huge win, because loads of policies around the country are based on self-ID. They aren't even based on the pieces of paper. And we were sure that the judges had listened and understood very sympathetically the arguments from the lesbian interveners, the arguments about the incoherence of the law, the argument about how it's irrational to see a difference between a trans person who has a piece of paper and a trans person who doesn't, and so on and so forth. So we were sure there would be very strong mitigating remarks if it went against For Women Scotland. And we were sure as well that the judges would say that it was a very unsatisfactory state of affairs and that Parliament should sort it out. So we were gearing up, I must say, quite potentially for another fight, just right. Continuing to fight with Parliament, which has ducked its responsibilities on this. And my colleague Maya Forstater, who co-founded Sex Matters, had written a 1 to 10 scale for how to understand the verdict, like how to think about it once it came out, and what we would do about each of the possibilities. And, you know, I'm a former journalist, we'll probably talk a bit about my background, but I'm well used to writing 2 versions of stories on deadline. For example, I used to be the finance editor at The Economist, and sometimes you would write stories that are based on things like interest rate decisions that you get no forenotice of, and that you really have to write full versions, 2 and sometimes even 3 of stories, and be ready to publish the right one. So we wrote pre-cooked statements for a win and a loss, and we expected that if there were sort of awkward elements of either that we'd have to quickly revise them and put them out. But in the event, I was the person who had the job of sitting there with my phone and then messaging my colleagues either the word win or loss as soon as we knew. I was able to send a win message, and immediately the colleague waiting back home deleted the content for loss, started uploading the content for win, and then as soon as we were able to come out and For Women Scotland had tweeted that they had won, we were able to put out our best case scenario pre-cooked analysis, unchanged, without a word changed, because the result was as good as it could possibly be, as clear as it could possibly be.
Amazing.
And yes, I was too caught up on the day to really feel it. And the last couple of days have been very hectic because we've had a lot of media requests, a lot of journalists who haven't understood this issue are looking for help to understand it now. So I'm beyond exhausted. But today I'm starting to feel a bit emotional about it because I've had some sleep, so I can kind of feel it again.
I think that the work that you've done over the years for you to see it live in action is incredible. And so when if we go back a bit in time, if you like, before the gender stuff, before this all became a part of your career, I was reading stuff over the last few days about your career, and I was surprised that this wasn't your first. This wasn't something that you've been doing your whole career. This isn't something that where your career started. So it'd be good to just get that background of what you were doing before and how you almost led into this path.
Sure. So I started at The Economist as a journalist in 2005, and I worked there for 17 years. But I did other things before that even. I had thought I was going to be an academic. So I actually have a PhD in mathematics, and I did several years of postdoc after getting that. I actually spent 11 years doing academic mathematics from the beginning of my first degree to the end of my last postdoc. And then I went into public understanding of maths and stats, which is kind of the stepping stone to journalism, although it's still an unusual route. So I edited 2 specialist magazines, one about applications of mathematics for the general public, and the other one was the magazine of the Royal Statistical Society, which still goes, and it's called Significance. And then in 2005, I saw a job out at The Economist, and I applied for it, and to my very great surprise got it, and I became the education correspondent based in the London offices. And then I went out to Brazil in 2010 to be South America correspondent based in Sao Paulo. 2014, I came back to head office and started editing the international section, which runs long reads on incredibly random topics that don't fit inside geographical regions and don't fit inside things like science or business or finance. And one fateful day in 2017, the editor of the paper sat down next to me at lunch and said, "Why do the kids keep coming home and saying such and such is trans?" I'd never heard of such a thing. I'd never heard of a child saying they were trans. I think I probably heard of adult transsexuals, and I'd probably heard the expression sex change, but not really understood what people meant by that. So I said, "I don't know, I'll look into it for you," as I had said many times to her before on many different topics. And in the end, I ended up writing an article myself, and that was a major discovery process because, so that was 2017, so I'd been at The Economist for 12 years at that point. And the way that people reacted to being asked questions was like nothing I'd ever seen. I mean, I had come back from nearly 4 years in Brazil at that point, and, I'd interviewed corrupt politicians and been written stories about horrible crimes and, all sorts. So people didn't want to talk about it. They told me that I was a bigot for asking questions. They flatly denied that there was any contradiction between saying
This was back in 2017.
2017.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. So that alerted to me to there being an issue. So I wrote an article, but The Economist doesn't have bylines. So that's why if you try looking to see what I wrote in 2017, you won't find anything. But in fact, I did write an article for The Economist in 2017. And then I was intrigued. I just stayed being intrigued about it because it struck me as just kind of mathematically weird. Like if you say a woman is anyone who defines themselves as a woman, or a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman, that's what mathematicians call a circular definition. It's a definition where you include the term to be defined in the criteria for being in the group. So it's like somebody saying, what's a wampoozle? A wampoozle is anyone who says they're a wampoozle. Now you don't know what a wampoozle is. You just don't know. It means nothing. You've given nothing to the person. And if you have a circular definition, then you can't define any sort of group. You can't say whether something is inside it or outside it. So a woman is anyone who says they're a woman is the same as saying there is no group that you can define as woman. And in fact, that is actually what a lot of trans activists say. But then you can't have women-only things because you can't say who's in the group and who's out of the group. And that's trivially obvious, but a lot of people who should know better refuse to accept it. And I started to think through the consequences of it. And then when I asked people about the consequences, they would block me on Twitter or send me emails saying I was a bigot or whatever. And that struck me as very interesting too. So in 2018, I really got worried about it. And I wrote another article. One ended up in The Economist, but I also wrote an article for Quillette. And that article turned into a book proposal. And because by 2019 I had realised that other people weren't going to write this book, and I had become convinced that it was a big scandal, that women's rights were being destroyed, and that children who were going to grow up gay otherwise were being given unnecessary and harmful medical treatment, that lesbian rights were being destroyed, and in fact, more than that, that institutions were being destroyed because they were embedding a lie at their heart and it was breaking them. It was breaking them in terms of safeguarding, policy making, sound administration. And that book came out. Now, I wrote that book when? I wrote that book in 2020 and it came out in 2021. And I really hoped that would set it all to rest for me personally. I was still at The Economist through all of that, and for a significant part of it, I was the finance editor. So, daytime was me talking about interest rates and bond markets and tariffs and Trump's trade war first time round. And then in the evening, I was thinking, why is this person saying that a natal man, a person with a penis, is a lesbian if he says he's a lesbian? What does that mean for lesbians? It was crazy making. So I ended up taking a leave of absence after my book came out because I had thought I would stop. I thought the book would bring an end to it for me, that I would think it through, I would write it down, and then I could move on. But actually it turned out there was no moving on. People wrote to me every day and told me tragic stories about their kids. That was the worst bit. Or tragic stories about themselves. And each day I thought, I can't actually leave this topic alone anymore. So in 2022, I resigned from The Economist, with their goodwill, I should say. They've been extremely good to me, unlike many journalistic outlets that have been horrible to the women who've written about this topic. And now I work for Sex Matters, which is the charity I mentioned.
I think that book, it was incredible. I always think your book and Miriam Grossman's book, Lost in Transnation, they're the two books that I had no idea any of this stuff. They were the first two books that I read that I thought, oh wow, this is actually a problem. But if I'm honest, I had not really seen it in person. I hadn't really seen lots of people that affected by it. But I think once I became aware and I read your book and her book, I started to really see very quickly after that what was kind of going on, and I couldn't believe the scale of this and how big this was. What was the reaction like after that book? Because I can imagine you probably got a fair amount of backlash and probably not so nice messages, or did you not? Did you get a lot of support, or what was the post the releasing of the book?
I actually got a really much more positive reaction than I thought I would. It was very hard to get it published. All I can say is that I always set my expectations rock bottom, and occasionally I was pleasantly surprised. So when I decided to write the book, I fully expected to have to self-publish it and market it myself on Twitter.
Right.
And I was doing it solely because I felt that I had a moral obligation to do so. And then I was surprised, very pleasantly surprised, to find a very good agent. And, the agent sent out the book proposal, which she told me was one of the best she'd ever seen. And I found precisely one publisher that was willing to buy it. But they were a great publisher, and my editor was fantastic. And she was so brilliant and supportive, gave me such good advice at every point. She didn't meddle, she didn't tell me much, but everything she told me was just spot on. And then the book came out and it got reviewed loads of places. It got reviewed in the New York Times, it got reviewed in most UK papers, mostly extremely positive reviews, and it sold very well. It went straight into the top 10 for non-fiction hardback. It stayed there for a few weeks, which is, that's something, it's an achievement, isn't it? So
Definitely.
although I could list, I could give a list as long as your arm of bad things that happened. I never got invited to a book festival, which is very unusual for a book that's a bestseller. My first book festival was just a few weeks ago, nearly 4 years later. I can't complain. Like, loads of good things happened, and mostly no, I don't get that much in the way of the hate. Like, I'm very proactive about blocking and muting unpleasant people online. I've probably, I don't know, I've blocked hundreds, at least, maybe thousands of people over the last few years, and I highly recommend it for your mental health.
Mm.
If somebody is trying to engage with you robustly, that's fine, one thing. But if somebody is abusive or bad faith, just block them straight away. It makes social media an awful lot nicer. So I just don't see most of the nastiness, frankly. And then there's been so much good stuff as well. I've met so many other people working in this space, and it's been extremely interesting. It's been exhausting. I've learned a lot. There's a lot of camaraderie, a lot of gallows humour on occasion. And how many people can say that they were part of a small group of people who, came up with arguments and thoughts that have ended up in a Supreme Court judgment ruling? I'm grateful. I'm grateful actually for what came out of the last few years, even though there's a very well funded, very well organised, completely misogynistic and homophobic movement seeking to destroy women and gay people's rights and to torment and mislead and harm children. And that's what I'm up against. That's upsetting when you actually think about that. But day to day, I'm fine.
How do you compete against that machine? Because that machine seems really, really big, and for a long time, it feels like so many institutions are like embedded by this effective machine. You can't really go against it. How do you even compete against that that scale and that size of an organization and organizations even?
Yeah, it's frightening, really, when you think about it. When you think about how government after government and institution after institution have fallen to what is, in effect, a particularly pernicious equivalent of flat earthery. Like, to say that people can change sex is as stupid and as wrong as saying that the earth is flat. But because it's about people, it is in some respects worse, because it's something that touches upon our health, our bodily integrity, our mental well-being, our protection for children, our intimate relationships, our safeguarding. If you weaken the idea of what the two sexes are, you weaken women's protections against sexual assault and violence. And when you look at it, you see that it's really truly dark, and that some of the people within it are there, not all I should say, and not even a majority, but some of them are there because they are predatory. It's a movement that is very enabling of predatory people, because it's an anti-boundary movement, and it's a movement that accepts people's lies about themselves as truths and positions you as a bigot if you won't accept those lies. So it is very dark. I would say, though, that once you see it and once you accept that it's your mission to do something about this, then it doesn't matter how bad it is. You've decided. And one of the things I often think is, each day when I wake up, I know what I'm meant to be doing today. And that's a relief, actually. That's something that a lot of people don't have. Like, a lot of people wake up and think that what they're doing doesn't matter, isn't worth doing, is fundamentally trivial, or, maybe it was fine, but they're feeling a bit lonely or bored or rudderless or something. I don't feel any of that. I feel I have a purpose and a mission. And I feel I'm part of a large group, distributed group. And by large, I mean, a few hundred, of people who have the same mission and who are there for me and I'm there for them. Yes, okay, we're up against great might. But this is the thing you have to understand. Some of those people care a lot about it, but most of them don't. If you think of the organisations that are pushing gender ideology, the idea that you're a man if you say you're a man, and a woman if you say you're a woman, and non-binary if you say you're neither. If you think about the people who work for the organisations that say that, most of them don't give a toss about anything.
Yeah.
They don't even really believe that. They're just there because it's the thing. They're just getting their paycheck. And also, those organisations are very anti-reality and anti-truth organisations, so they hire very poor people. And you see that whenever they actually get challenged. So if you look at an interview with anybody, on the rare occasions that someone from one of those organisations is willing to do an interview, they have no idea what their opponents think. Their logic is the logic of a toddler. They can't make an argument, they can't defend themselves because they're so insulated. So we're strong and battle hardened, yes, much smaller and yes, much less well funded. But they're idiots and they're weak because their ideas are based on lies and because they shield themselves from any genuine challenge. So actually, it's a kind of David and Goliath situation. You know, we've literally just seen 3 Scottish women, ordinary women who met on Mumsnet. I know them, all 3 of them personally, and they are extraordinary as people. But they're ordinary in the sense that they have ordinary jobs, they have day jobs, they have families they have to look after, sick parents, kids, whatever. And yet the 3 of them, with no institutional support and no background in the law or anything like that, have just won a victory at the Supreme Court against the national regulator, the Scottish government, one of the world's biggest and most famous charities, Amnesty. Okay, they got help from an army of ordinary and extraordinary women. But it was Goliath being defeated comprehensively by David. And that's because we're strong, we're right, we're battle-hardened. They're weak, flabby, stupid, ignorant, and basing their ideas on lies.
I want to go through the people you mentioned that you're fighting against, and I think it'd be really good to get your take on. I think, it's, like you said, there's different categories of people. Some are just outright stupid, some are a bit more sinister. I think one of the ones I'd be really interested to get your take is on a lot of the organizations who almost have decided to support this without really understanding what it means. We've seen a lot of them already reverse. I think following even Trump's election, so many of these groups overnight they basically changed their way of thinking. And I personally find it really difficult when I see people who are educated and who are in good positions of authority and good jobs, and they say absolutely nothing, or they support the trans movement without really understanding it. And I find it really hard to understand why those people would support that, other than it's just maybe the trendy thing to do. How have you dealt with those kind of people, if you like?
Okay, so the first thing I'll say is that almost nobody has a mission of any sort, and the people who have a mission have just one mission. So you can't be surprised that most people don't care about something. Like, no matter what it is that you say, hardly anyone cares about it. So if I think about all the terrible things that are happening in the world today, including things that I do know what I think about, but also things I don't know anything about. You know, I've lost touch with South America, for example. I don't know what's happening in countries I used to care about a lot. I couldn't tell you who the Chilean president is right now, for example. But also you just think about, like, I'm vaguely aware that something terrible is happening in, China, that the repression of the Uyghurs. Obviously, there's bad things happening in Ukraine, bad things happening in the Middle East. But I have no headspace for that. I've chosen something else. And most people have no mission at all. They're just trying to be decent parents, children, siblings, colleagues, friends, keep a roof over their head, get bread on the table, that sort of thing. They owe us nothing. They don't owe us understanding. And then if you're running a business and it's a profit-seeking business, or it's got a different mission, they don't owe us understanding on this either. Where we are owed understanding that matters is 2 places. One is organisations whose missions should incorporate them understanding this issue, and the other is HR departments. So let's take them separately. So all the organisations that were set up to support women or gay people really do need to have their heads straight on the question of who is a woman and who is gay. And with very few exceptions, every one of them has failed this test comprehensively. I remember when I first got my head around this thought, Stonewall, which is our preeminent LGB organisation, decided to add the T 10 years ago in 2015. And until then, one of its main concerns was that gender non-conforming children, who were statistically much more likely than others to grow up gay, were bullied horribly because, people would call them slurs and say that they were going to grow up to be gay. And they cared a lot about those kids and protecting them and helping them to grow up into healthy, fully functioning adults who could have a happy sex life as gay people. Now those kids, they encourage, by what they do and what they say, to take unproven and harmful medical treatments that end up with them being sterile, sexually functionless, probably a load of other malign impacts as well, but in particular to pretend that they're the opposite sex and that way they're straight. So Stonewall's mission flipped 180 degrees to do the most, from supporting those kids to doing the most harmful possible thing for those kids. And the same is true in different respects of organisations that were set up to help women. You know, once you say that a man can be a woman and you're going to help that man in the way that you used to help women, you're actually going to help the worst sort of men, which is the men who want to force women to do what they want, as in to do what the men want. So you become a men's rights activist organisation. And we've seen that all around us. We've seen all the organisations that were set up to support women and support gay people become the most harmful towards us. It's very painful when you see it. And then there's just all the other organisations that just decided to do a bit of virtue signalling with the rainbow washing because it's a cheap way to look like good people, certainly much cheaper than actually supporting, say, disabled people in the workplace. And then all the HR departments that are filled with people who went to university and did stupid courses like gender studies and sociology and came out with ridiculous ideas because they'd been forced to read Judith Butler. And then they graduate and they end up in an HR department somewhere and they destroy the organisation's fundamental protections and provisions for women. They do things like make the toilets gender neutral and tell everyone they have to have preferred pronouns and the like, and they do witch hunts against any woman who says no thank you. So that's how it happens. The people at the top are thinking about other things. They're trying to think about profits. They're doing what they think is the right thing when they've looked for about 10 seconds. And then the last group I would add to that are there's a non-negligible number of people in powerful positions in this country and across the world who have trans to their children. So if they haven't done it to their own children, it'll be friends of theirs who have. So any boardroom or similar place where decision makers and movers and shakers gather, there will be somebody who is personally invested in the narrative that a child can be born in the wrong body, can be trans, and that person is like a force field that distorts the whole discussion around them and makes it impossible for anyone to use reality-based language, to state clear facts, to say that, you know, outside the walls of this company it may be the case that the world has gone mad, but inside, no, men who identify as women cannot use women's spaces and similar sorts of policies. And that has happened all over the media, publishing, politics, all the organisations that control what we see, what we read, what we hear, our meaning-making organisations, our policy-making organisations. And that's quite terrifying when you think about it like that.
And it's so true because I think the good example is Disney, and I'm going to get this not completely accurate. So just where there is a Disney person who has two trans kids, and I think something of the odds of that being the case is close to like 0.00001. It's just off the scale, and naturally, I can imagine if somebody tries to make the discussion about women's rights and stuff like that, then it straight away that person will say it. And I had an example where I know a mother in the UK who had other mothers who felt the same way towards one of the mums whose boys was competing in the swimming competitions, but then they were so scared to say anything because then there's a chance of exclusion and the chance of it becoming this sort of political debate. But these are not, maybe unlike yourself, who've got that kind of willpower and strength. I think a lot of ordinary people maybe don't have the courage to speak out. But I think what's sad is by not speaking out, the impact it's had is so profound. Like I just think I find it really hard for what I'm trying to say is I find it really hard that there's been a real lack of people not speaking out, just rational, normal people just speaking out from the start and basically saying this is just wrong. Like how can you not?
But the thing is, it's rational not to speak out. Like you only get one life, and if this isn't inside your own house, why would you upend your entire life to speak about this? You know, the incentives are so poorly aligned with good outcomes on this particular topic.
Right.
I can never advise somebody to speak out on this because it blows up their life. And, I can't tell them that it'll work out okay for them in the end because I know often it doesn't. And that's why it gets left to a small number of people. I mean, I should say it doesn't affect me personally. It's not inside my house. It's not something that is inside my family or my personal circle. And therefore, I'm able to speak without feeling, that it's too close to me. But then, of course, why did I do that? I don't have to. You see what I mean? Like, either it's so close to you that it's dangerous to say something, or it's not close enough and you just think, look, this is madness. So if you think about sports, for example, I think it was Kathy Devine, who's a researcher. She did a study of, now I'm going to get details wrong, but anyway, it was very high up female athletes. Now, was it people who competed at the international level? I don't remember the group anyway, but she guaranteed them complete anonymity. And so she asked them what they thought about self-ID policies in sport, men being allowed to play in women's sport if they say they're women. And I mean, it was nearly every woman said that they were utterly, completely 100% against it. They said that they supported bringing back cheek swabs, which is just a non-invasive once-in-a-lifetime thing. You just get a bit of saliva and it proves whether you're male or female. And you then get a sort of document saying that you can compete in women's sports for the rest of your life. It's the way it used to run. And then she also got people writing in screeds about how terrible they felt for not saying anything about this, not doing anything about it. But they would say that their policies in their sport or in their team classed, inverted commas, transphobia as being as bad as homophobia or racism. So in other words, if they were to say men shouldn't compete as women, that's the same as using a racial or homophobic slur. So they would be suspended. Their policies for their sponsors, and if you think about somebody who sponsors a sports team or anything else, they're doing it to burnish their own reputation. And the main thing they want you to do is not be controversial. It's not a question of whether you're right or wrong. They just don't want you to bring the wrong sort of attention. So even if you're not in a team, or even if you're not subject to that sort of gagging policy because of the sport that you're in or the team that you're in, if you speak out, you will immediately lose all sponsorship.
Right.
And women get very little money in sport. Only about 1,000 women in the UK earn enough from sport that it's their living. I think it's 11,000 men. So there's a big disadvantage there. And of course, the amounts are very different as well. So are you going to lose the, 4 figures, maybe 5 if you're lucky, a sponsorship for a particular type of trainer or t-shirt or endorsing an energy drink or something like that by saying something that's so obvious? Or are you going to keep your head down and hope that it won't affect you and you feel terrible, but it's rational what you're doing? And also the few people who do speak out, their kids get threats. They get death threats. They get a very concerted attempt to defame them and knock them down and, invent stories or blow things up out of proportion to make them look like bad people. It's horrible. It's horrible being at the end of these vitriolic hate campaigns. I can't possibly say that it's rational to bring it upon yourself if you don't have to. I was in too far before I knew what it was going to be like. But also I'm really very privileged in terms of it not being something that can hurt me or impact me too much because of my personal situation and my ability to earn a living. And also, basically, I don't care what people I despise say about me or think about me. But a lot of people don't feel like that.
When did it become for you that this was going to be like your mission? Was it just in 2017, 2018 when you just thought this is what I'm maybe not born to do, but this is what I'm going to do now, that this is it?
Yeah, no, it definitely wasn't straight away. The thing is, the sort of journalism that I did at an outlet like The Economist is a very high-minded place where people take very seriously the idea of grappling with ideas. And I had become very seized of stories before. So when I lived in Brazil, I ate, breathed, slept Brazil for nearly 4 years. I thought about nothing else but why was this country the way it was? And it was emotionally and intellectually very engaging. And then when I came back, I got very interested in some other stories when I was international editor. And then as finance editor, I became completely fascinated by, how world trade works, how markets work. Although, again, I'm not a specialist. I did not train as an economist. So this one, I thought initially would just be the same. It would be another of maybe over a lifetime as a journalist, there might have been 15 or 20 big stories at most, maybe less, maybe only about 10. that seized my imagination and my intellect and became a thing that I would think about consistently for quite a long time. I thought it was going to be like that. I wasn't going to write a book. I've seen many colleagues write books, and one of the object lessons about books, when I started at The Economist, the office I was in was next door to a cupboard, literally a cupboard that was called the books cupboard. And once a week, someone from the books and arts section would come down with a trolley and offload, I don't know, a couple of hundred books into that cupboard, and they were there for several days, and anyone could take them if they wanted them. And then at the end of every week, somebody would come and take them for a charity, as far as I know, a charity that passed them on to places like prisons for their libraries. And I would look through that book cupboard on lunch breaks, and I would often take a book, but I was just aware how many books there are in the world and how, people are so glad they get one review somewhere. They send their review copies out. Almost none of them ever get read. They end up in a book cupboard, and then they end up at the charity, and they probably end up in landfill. So I was never going to write a book. Also, the colleagues who wrote them, my God, it takes over your life. It's worse than having a baby. Yeah, and so I said no. I was not going to write a book, and I resisted writing a book as a result about this. I kept thinking someone should write a book, but I'm not going to write a book. And then I went to an event in 2019 run by a lesbian collective in the north of England. I think it was in Manchester. And they invited some detransitioners. And I had heard of the concept of detransition at that point. So people who had identified as a member of the opposite sex for some time and then decided that that was nonsense and abandoned that identification. And I sat there at this event and I listened to these girls, they were all girls as it happens, talk about the homophobic and misogynistic ideas and the intellectual grooming that had got them to believe the mad idea that they were actually boys. And some of them had medicalised, several of them had had their breasts removed and taken testosterone, and one of them had had her uterus and her ovaries removed as well, and she was only 23. And I sat there, now I have two kids myself, they're both boys, and one of them is gay. Now, he was only little at that point, but he was, when I say little, he was a teenager. He was gay. He's always been somebody who was going to grow up gay. And I'm very supportive of people who are gay because I understand from the research, well, I would be anyway because it's a personal choice, but specifically I'm telling you why I personally feel strongly about this. I know enough about the research to know that it's an innate characteristic a lot of the time. So being gay or being straight is as fundamental a part of you as being a man or being a woman. And I care a lot that kids who are always going to grow up to be gay have a particularly difficult time in childhood and through teenage years, in part because of homophobia, but also because they're the minority. And it's a thing to learn about yourself. And I sat there listening to these girls and I thought to myself, you say you care about gay kids. You say you're a journalist. You say that you care about the truth and that you want to be somebody who's fearless in speaking. And if you don't write about this, all of that's a lie. So that was the day I decided to write the book. And I thought, as I said, I thought I would self-publish it, etc. But then it wrote itself. I don't actually like writing, even though I was doing it for a living at the time and still do a lot of writing. I like thinking about what I'm going to write. I like planning it. I like talking about it. I like having written it. I like editing it. The bit in the middle where you actually have to write the words down is always very painful. But this book wrote itself. I couldn't stop myself. I woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning and wrote for 3 hours before work. I wrote at the weekends. I wrote the whole book in 5 months while I was working full time and doing significant amounts of family care as well. It was the most exhausting thing I've done in my life, even more exhausting than being involved in the Supreme Court case, because it went on for so much longer. But I couldn't not do it. It had to be done. It had moral urgency.
Amazing. And that's what's interesting is you mentioned the detransitions, and I feel like that's very rarely, if ever, in the conversation when we talk about the trans, the amount of people who detransition and go back to their gender with lifelong consequences. Why do you think not enough people talk and share that story again publicly? I know I've heard some horror stories about people who have detransition and they get some really vile abuse from the trans community for them speaking out publicly. Do you think that's one of the reasons? And why have we not heard a lot about detransitions? The average person probably hasn't seen a lot or heard a lot regarding them.
I mean, there are a small number of people in part because the social contagion that created a large number of people identifying as trans is only about maybe 15 years old at the very earliest, and maybe only 10. So there's going to be a coming wave of detransitioners. It's already starting, but there just aren't a lot of them yet.
Right.
So that's one reason. Another is it's an extremely unhappy story. And, like it's the sort of unhappy that there's no silver lining, there's no way to turn it around at the end. And that's the sort of story that doesn't sell newspapers or magazines or get clicks or advertising. And journalism, especially nowadays, is really it's really on the ropes, and each story stands on its own as something that people will click through to. So it's rage bait, or it's clickbait, or it's a feel-good story, or whatever. These stories are hard. They're hard to report. They're hard to write. And there's no way that you can say at the end, oh, there's redemption here. But I think the biggest reason is that you have to understand the idea that somebody can change sex as being a belief system. It's a novel religion, in effect. And a detransitioner is therefore an apostate. They're not even a heretic. I mean, I'm a heretic. They're an apostate. And the people who proselytizing religions treat worst are apostates. So they are people who are more hated than anybody else by the trans movement. I mean, they hate me enough, but my God, they hate detransitioners. In their very existence, they are proof that it's not the case that a trans person is born that way, that it's an innate, unchangeable characteristic of you, that you came out of the womb trans, that you simply need to discover your true self. So they're like a proof that the religion is false. And they have to be silenced by any means necessary. And then the final thing is they find it very hard to tell their stories. They're deeply traumatized. They're victims of medical malpractice. People like that are often, they're unstable in their desire to tell their story. What's happened to them is an outrage, and they feel they want to tell the outrage. But then when they start to tell you about it, it's so traumatizing that they pull back. And I've seen that happen again and again with detransitioners. They're hard on journalists. They don't trust journalists, and I understand why, because so many let them down. But even if they find a good one, they start to tell their story, and then they pull back, and then they go back again, and then they ghost you. And, it's because they're trauma victims. You have to understand that. And then also, they often went through a whole process when they started to identify as trans of casting off all their old friends. Sometimes they cast off their families. They went into a sort of a new glitter family with trans-identifying people. They became super into the activism, and then it turned out it was the wrong thing for them to do, and they've hurt themselves, and they pull out, and now they lose that support group, but there's nothing to go back to. The person that they were, the body has changed often. Anybody who might support them, like their parents, is somebody that they think will tell them, I told you so. And I mean, the parents don't tend to. The parents are desperate to have their kids back. But there's deep shame in having made such a decision that harmed you so much and that you were so desperate to make. So when I was interviewing people for my book, I reached out to a friend who's a psychotherapist. She's a psychologist and a psychotherapist, and she gave me some very, very useful advice that I'd never received as a journalist before, because I'd never been to a war zone or anything like that. And she said to me when she started to train, she's American and she's a bit older than me, she said it was the era at which the Vietnam vets were coming back, and they were deeply traumatized. And she was working with somebody, she was, her mentor. And the way you do that is that they psychoanalyze you. I'm using the wrong word. She's not a psychoanalyst, but, you go through a process with them. And the first thing he did is he said to her, don't let them tell you the full story on the first day. So he said, typically traumatized people come in and they want to tell you the whole awful thing, whatever the terrible thing is.
Right.
The child abuse, the rape, the witnessing murder, the whatever it is, And they tell the whole thing to you in a big verbal diarrhea, and then you will never see them again. Because they have treated you the way that the Vietnam vet will treat the taxi driver who drives them to the airport in the pouring rain, in the dark. You sit in the back of the cab. You unburden yourself temporarily by telling the whole story because you know you'll never see this person again. And she said to me, you have to understand that at the heart of trauma is very deep shame. these kids are so ashamed of what happened to them. In the same way that rape victims are often wrongly ashamed of what happened to them. But more than that, this is something that they sought out. They chose to do this. They often fought other people to be allowed to do this. They proselytized about it. Many of them, one of the things they have said to me is many of them say they made other people transition. They sold the idea of transition to other people who are now unhappy about it. And so she said, don't let them tell you the whole thing on the first interview, because they'll ghost you. They'll never talk to you again. They won't give you permission to use the quotes. And you'll have done an interview and you won't be able to use it. So she said that what they do in counselling is they keep saying, no, let's just go back a bit. Let's just talk about your childhood first. Tell me about your family. Tell me about your parents. Tell me about primary school. And you keep heading them off before they tell you the thing. And not until several meetings in will you allow them to talk about the thing. Because by then they've got a rapport with you and hopefully they understand that they can open up in front of you without being ashamed. And I guess if I don't think I will at this point in my life, but if I ever do any reporting in war zones or disaster zones, that will be useful advice. But so far it's only been the detransitioners that I've had to use it with.
With the detransitioners, and even just general the transitioners who now have regret, what do you think should happen to maybe some of the doctors or some of the people who coerce these people into doing this surgery? So many parents were told that story. Do you want to have a dead child if you don't do this? That kind of really crazy persuasion. What do you think should happen to those people who decided to actually perform the surgery or give the advice that they should change?
This question is funny for me because it actually came up at this literary festival that I was at a few weeks ago. Okay. So if you don't mind me telling the story of that, I realise I'm giving very long answers and you're being very kind to let me ramble on. So hopefully
it's interesting to listen to. It's good to get the full.
Okay. So I was speaking at the Oxford Literary Festival and it was, as I say, a few weeks ago, and one of the people in the audience was Richard Dawkins, who has been very supportive, and I've interviewed him on stage and I've done an event with him at the House of Lords and various things. So I invited him, and at the end he asked me the question you asked. He said, these doctors, the gender clinicians, they have sworn the Hippocratic Oath. I mean, it's actually different wording now, but anyway, they've sworn to do no harm, first do no harm, and they've done so much harm. When are any of them going to, now did he say go to prison, or did he say face consequences? I can't remember. And this was by the end of the event, and I rambled on a bit, but what I said, and I stand by this a lot, is they're not going to face any consequences. You have to understand this is just the latest in a series of medical scandals. Roughly speaking, the modern medical industry is about 2 centuries old. Before that, it was just, local, inverted commas, wise women or just handed down remedies or whatever. But it started to become formalised, and there came to be an authority figure called the doctor. And since then, especially psychosomatic illnesses, the ones that are, have partly a mental dis-ease, but that gets felt on the body, that's called somatizing, they get shaped by the medical industry and the medical ideas of your era and your place. And doctors kind of shape them. The doctor and patient shapes them together. And there's absolutely incontrovertible evidence that a lot of social contagions or psychic contagions are like this. Things like shell shock. We don't get shell shock now. Shell shock was a specific thing that was basically invented by doctors and returning soldiers from the First World War together, and it shaped the symptoms. And very often the treatments were brutal, ineffective. On women, they would generally take out their reproductive organs. But nobody ever suffers consequences for having given these terrible treatments. Nobody suffered consequences for lobotomies. The man who invented the lobotomy got the Nobel Prize for it, and it was not taken away from him, and it still stands as his Nobel Prize. The guy who did most of them, the guy who invented the ice pick method, that you go in via the orbital lobe, he used to go around in a travelling circus with retinues. He would turn up at mental institutions. They would have the patients already sedated for them so that he could move along and do them like an assembly line. He hadn't met them beforehand. He hadn't diagnosed them. Many people tried to stop that. Many people in the hospitals raised concerns. Nobody managed to stop it. Tens of thousands of lobotomies were performed before they said this is a scandal. He spent the rest of his life going around trying to keep his reputation up, telling people that what he had done was the right thing. This is going to be like that. These people, there is going to be no justice. Anyway, in the OLF, in the Oxford Literary Festival, I said a version of that, and then I said, of course, I'd love them to go to jail. Mm-hmm. So the two news items that came out of it, one in the Telegraph and one in the Times, both written by journalists, I don't know, I think arts correspondents, both of them led on. Helen Joyce says she'd like to send the gender surgeons to jail. Helen Joyce would love to send the gender surgeons to jail, but they're not going to go to jail. And neither of them recognised Richard Dawkins as the person who asked the question, which I thought told you something about the state of education in this country. So yeah, they're not going to go to jail. They're really not. And then if I may, in this incredibly long answer that has multiple parts, I'll say one other thing, which is typically when a child ends up sterilised, there was no person who made that decision along the way. The decision-making was distributed over a chain, and every person can say with some plausibility that it wasn't their fault. So what happens is a kid picks an idea up, commonly online, but sometimes in school. Their parents become terrified about this. They bring them to see a local GP, a family doctor. That person says, I don't know anything about gender, but there's a clinic. They go to the clinic. The person at the clinic, in America, they will suggest, gender stuff to you. But here, in the clinic, they're usually a bit more cautious. They will talk to you complete nonsense about gender dysphoria, and they won't say to you, look, you can't change sex, let's not cause you any harm. And to speed up, they will maybe give you a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. They will then refer you to an endocrinologist. Right. They don't give you any drugs. The endocrinologist doesn't give you a diagnosis either. They just check that your blood sugar is okay, that your blood pressure is okay, that your general health is okay, that your heart rate's okay, etc. And then they give you a prescription based on someone else's diagnosis. Now you're medicalised. And if you were referred for surgery, the surgeon hasn't done anything. The surgeon hasn't diagnosed you. The surgeon didn't give you drugs. The surgeon accepts in this chain of trust that the only people who turn up for surgery have already been selected as the right people. And all they do is just check your general health. Do you understand what the surgery is going to be? Is your blood pressure okay, etc., etc. And then they do an operation that will sterilise you. So you've got to the end of this. In this country, nobody will be sterilised under the age of 18. But the story will have started earlier. Right. A child ends up sterilised and nobody made that decision. And every one of them trusted that somebody else would either wield the knife or choose the child as the right child.
You think that's going to be hard, though? Because in terms of, people want obviously sometimes accountability. I don't want to say revenge, but accountability. So what, for I'm guessing for a lot of people, they just won't get that, that kind of...
No, they won't get it. No, they won't get it. They won't get it. People don't get accountability. There's hardly ever accountability. I don't know why people think there is. We all know this. Look at the post office scandal. Look at public inquiries. I mean, every now and then somebody becomes the public face, like Paula Venables is the public face of the post office scandal. Loads of people knew, and none of them are going to be brought to justice. And certainly the people who committed suicide because of the post office scandal, the people whose lives were ruined, the people who, ended their days under a cloud of shame or were sent to prison, they're not going to get back what they should have. There might be a compensation scheme sometimes. Yeah. The same with infected blood, all these things. No, there's no accountability. And then if you think of smaller things, not scandals, you think of personal things, somebody who's been stalked or somebody who has been targeted by, I don't know, a corrupt policeman or something like that. They never get justice. I'm amazed anyone thinks they might even, ever. My base case is that it almost never happens. And in this case, the harm is so great and it has been so endorsed by so many people. One of the things I say very cynically to people in my current circles that I learned very much from my journalistic career is the golden rule of public inquiries is they are never called until absolutely everybody who did anything is already gone. So they only start them when there's nobody that could actually end up in jail or have their money taken away from them or similar. And then they spend a lot of public money and then they end up saying lessons will be learned. I mean, look at it. Look at the child sex abuse scandal at the moment, the grooming gangs. We've just had a series of child sex abuse scandals in the Catholic Church, in Boy Scouts, in children's homes. Every one of them led to an inquiry. There was a child sex abuse scandal just going on, a child sex abuse inquiry going on really recently. And here we are again. No, lessons will not be learned. No, there will be no accountability. If you think you want these things to stop, there is no one but you to do it.
And that kind of leads well to sort of the next question. What's next for you now? So you've had that, phenomenal result in Scotland. Is that part of the mission completed, or do you think you've got a lot more left to do? Like, what's next?
There's a lot left to do. I mean, it's an incredibly important stage. It's not just that it was the right result. It's that the way that the judgment was written was so super clear and so unambiguous. So in case I haven't said exactly what the judgment is that the words man, woman, male, female and sex in the Equality Act unambiguously mean biology, not identity or paperwork. And the Equality Act is a big law. It governs when it's lawful or unlawful to discriminate by sex. And if you think about it, like the word discrimination is one of those words people think, oh, all discrimination is bad. But every time you notice a difference, you're discriminating. That's what the word originally meant, distinguishing between things. So if you put up a sign saying, these are the ladies' toilets, that's sex discrimination. But it's lawful sex discrimination, not unlawful sex discrimination. It'd be unlawful to put an ad in the paper saying, barkeeper wanted must be a man. Because there's no good reason for the barkeeper to be a man. There is a good reason for the toilets to be single sex. So the Equality Act governs the provision of single sex and separate sex services and also employment. So when you can advertise a job that's for one sex or the other. And that is a very large part of all of the law that relates to differences between the two sexes. So now we can go back to employers, government, regulators, industry bodies and so on and say all the policies that say anything other than sex means sex, not gender identity, they're all unlawful now. But we have to actually do that work. It has to cascade. I hope to God the government takes it up because they can do it. They can do it top down. If they don't do it top down, we have to do it bottom up. And this nonsense is everywhere. It's in pretty much every school in the country. It's in the NHS. The rules that say single-sex wards say that if a man says he's a woman, you put the man into the women's wards, and so on and so forth. So the coming weeks are going to be crucial, actually. It's a question whether this law really, gets picked up by the authorities and then pushed out to the duty bearers around the country, or whether nobody in officialdom does anything and it's left again to the grassroots to force it through painfully. Like, do you know how many schools there are in the country? Like, have a guess.
Thousands, maybe? I don't know.
Thousands and thousands. It's more than 20,000. Do we really have to go to 20,000 plus schools and tell people who don't want to hear, don't know about the law, weren't paying attention, aren't lawyers, think that we're bigots, one at a damn time, that they have to stop letting boys who identify as girls into the girls' toilets, stop making their toilets gender neutral, stop teaching children that it's possible to change sex? No, that has to be the Department for Education does that. But, one of the things I was kind of hinting at when I said that thing about how nobody made the decision to sterilise the child is there's a huge crisis in responsibility and accountability. Nobody wants to take it. It tends to be that if you go to a regulator like the Charity Commission, they'll say, oh, it's up to the charity. If you go to the charity, they say, well, if we're doing something wrong, the Charity Commission will tell us. Everybody bats the responsibility somewhere else. I hope I'm not being unfair to the government there. I hope that this government actually does do some of this work because they could. The judgment was so clear. But if they don't, we'll have to do it. So that'll be a while. There are legal cases. We've got legal challenges underway. One of the legal challenges that we started before this judgment was against British Transport Police because it has a policy. No, I'll just back up a little bit there. First, I'll say this isn't the only law where sex matters, the Equality Act. It's a big one, but there are other ones.
Right.
So one example is PACE, Police and Criminal Evidence Act. And that's the law that governs all sorts of things, but in particular the rules on searching. So if a police officer or anyone else who searches does anything more than telling you to take off your hat, coat and gloves, anything more than that, the search has to be by somebody of the same sex. And that's been the case for decades, unambiguously written down. But you can see where this is going. In recent years, police forces have reinterpreted that to say either that it's a question of whether you have a gender recognition certificate or how you identify. And British Transport Police's policy said that if a police officer has a gender recognition certificate, they search in that sex. So if a man has a piece of paper saying he's a woman, he searches as a woman. And also that if a detainee says, just simply says, because they understand you don't carry your paperwork with you, if they just say, I'm a woman, they must be searched by a woman. Now, I hope for your sake you've never been strip searched. I haven't either. But I've heard about it because I've interviewed police officers and I've interviewed people who've experienced strip searching. You take off everything on the top of you, and if you have big boobs, they lift your boobs up and look under them. You then put that top back on, you take everything off from the waist down. You can hold your butt cheeks and bend over. They will move your genitals if they need to look around them. It's an extremely degrading and invasive thing to have done to you. So obviously it's done by someone of the same sex. But BTP's policy is that a man who simply says, I'm a woman, after being arrested, must be searched by a woman. And I've interviewed a bunch of female police officers, and they say that, you're commonly treated like shit when you detain men, when you arrest men. They say grotesque things to you. They try to get you to react by, sexualized insults, by saying what they'd like to do to you, if you're young and pretty in particular. And so now they can say, I'm a woman. She's got to search me. And they get to take off all their clothes in front of you. And I know women this has happened to. So we've taken a legal challenge against that because that isn't in the Equality Act. Okay, it's a different law. But the reasoning in the judgment, how could it possibly be that the Supreme Court says that for women's safety, dignity and privacy, when we say toilets are single sex, we really mean single sex? But by the way, when a man has to take off all his clothes and show you his genitals, we don't mean sex, we just mean paperwork or what he says. That's just inconceivable.
How is that passed? How
has this happened?
Yeah, how are you, in the scenario you've given, how has nobody, again, some higher power upstairs, whatever, said, this is ridiculous?
They are pushing it. Most police forces have this policy by now. The reason we're going after BTP is because the policy was revised and brought out recently enough. You have 3 months to take what's called a judicial review against a new policy. So they're the people who brought out a policy at the right time. There's loads of policies like this. Police forces around the country operate on this policy. And worse than that, the National Police Chiefs Council, which is a talking shop of chief constables, that's the policy they recommend. And we've gone to them and we've said this is unlawful, and they say it's just our recommendation. It's not a formal policy. We're not making police forces do this. But if you go to the police force, they say, oh, the National Police Chiefs Council says that's how you have to do it. That pattern is everywhere. Everywhere. If you go to a university and say, see that policy there, that infringes on academic freedom, they say, oh, we got that policy from Athena Swan or some one of the other, quasi-regulators, talking shop type places. You go to Athena Swan and they say, oh, it's just our recommendation of what to do, talk to the university. It's incredible.
When you When you started with the police thing, and you gave the example, correct me if I'm wrong, with the police officer who can identify as a man can say he's a woman, therefore he can search a woman that's under arrest or whatever. Even when you said that, I thought that's concerning. You can feel like abuse of power. You can feel all this sort of stuff. And I like to think most police officers are. I think they get a really harsh job and it's difficult for them. But even that said, still there is clearly, there are going to be bad police officers, like bad doctors, bad anything. And if you can give them the power to that, then there's a bit of a problem there. But when you then said that the person who's probably committed the crime, who's been committed the crime, you've already got some issues with that person, there's probably some safeguarding issues, is that person can then just by default say that that's their gender and the police officer has to comply. They cannot. I never worked in the police, but I've now interviewed and talked to a bunch of female police officers about this, and one of them said to me that she arrested a man once, and when you arrest people, usually they're drunk or they're on drugs or they're going through a mental episode or they're terrible people. You're not talking about people who are in full control of their faculties and that everything's just a nice friendly chat down over Sunday lunch. It's not like that. Commonly it's pub closing time. Anyway, she arrested this guy and she was in the back of the police van with him and he exposed himself to her.
So she complained, she made a crime report, he was prosecuted, and he was found guilty. Now, that doesn't take back the fact that he committed indecent exposure to her, but it gives her justice. So, that was a good outcome. Yeah. Now, she hasn't yet had to search a man who says he's a woman, but one of her friends has. So it's a friend in a different force. This friend, this guy, did he say he was non-binary or did he say he was a woman? But it was really clearly, like, very often if you're a female police officer, you're the only female police officer in the surroundings. Like, people are sometimes searched outside custody suites, but often they're searched within them. But often there's only one woman, because not many women are arrested. Nearly everyone arrested is a man. So it's men searching men. If there's a woman arrested, it's usually you that's going to have to search them because you're the only one. And it's always unpleasant. You feel very bad for the woman that you're searching. It's awful. The woman is very, very often extremely vulnerable. She's in a mental health crisis. She's out of her head. It's that sort of thing. So you're trying to do it in as dignified a way as possible, but it's hard for you to. It's a horrible situation. Anyway, her friend said that this man said, I'm a woman. But the thing is, she's the only woman around. So he's obviously looking at her and thinking, this is fun. I'm going to take the piss. So she said to the custody sergeant that she didn't want to do it. And he said to her something like, don't be a wuss, get on with it. And the thing is that if you're given a lawful order as a police officer, you must obey it. And if you don't, it's severe disciplinary and you will be suspended and you'll be investigated. And that will take a long time, like a year. Right. And you may eventually be exonerated, but you will then be treated like shit for the rest of your life within the police because you're somebody who didn't do what you were meant to do. You don't do it. You just don't do it. Like, in theory you can, but in practice you don't. So she tried a couple of times to say, look, this is unfair. You know that he's misusing his power. And in the end, the custody sergeant said to her, would you just get on with it? You're holding things up. So she did it. And she said she felt violated. She said, I was subjected to a sex crime by my superior within the police force at the behest of a man who had just been arrested. And there's nothing I can do about it.
Crazy. And I'm guessing that some of the work you're going to be doing is helping. That's the next challenges, I suppose.
Well, it's all the other laws, isn't it? We fixed the Equality Act now, but there's a whole load of other laws. So I should finish the end of that story. It's not the end, it's the current status. And BTP withdrew their search policy the day after the Supreme Court judgment.
Oh, amazing.
And they haven't said what they're going to replace it with. Well, they've gone back to searching by sex. We were asked for comment yesterday by a journalist about this. They said, are you withdrawing your case? And we said, no, not until they actually have a new policy, and that policy is back to what it should be based on sex. And as I say, there are many other police forces that have similar policy. The NPCC recommends this sort of policy, and that's just one sector. That's just the police. There's probation services, there's prison services, there's border forces. All of them do searches. These search policies don't just cover criminals or detainees, they cover visitors to prisons. We know of men who identify as women who work within the border police, border forces. We know of men who identify as women who work within prison, the prison guard system. Those men are now currently classified as women for the purposes of searching not just female prisoners, but female visitors to prison. You can be strip searched if you want to visit a high security prison. You can see why. But it's horrible, and you don't want to have a man doing it. So that's just searching. Now we've got hospital wards. We've got schools. Every institution you can think of has become seized of this ludicrous notion that a man who says he's a woman is a woman. So the question is, how do you cascade this judgment right through all of them and rip out all of those policies? And if I think about it at that scale, it's terrifying because it's so much. It feels like you're trying to clear an enormous garden of Japanese knotweed.
I'm guessing it's, like you said earlier, the government can hopefully make it easier, or somehow, I don't.
Well, the government should be doing it, but the government should have done it already. Yeah. None of these policies were ever lawful.
Yeah. So, well, Helen, look, I could keep talking to you for a lot longer. It's been amazing chatting to you. We have like a closing thing I do on this show where it can be something that we've discussed. It can be completely trivial, but essentially, what is something that you think is unpopular? So an opinion that you have that is unpopular, but you think should be popular. So it can be something that we discussed already. It can be something completely different. But yeah, just a general.
Oh, you should have given me a bit of pre-notice of this because I'm going to sit here now and think.
Yeah, it can be absolutely.
What should be popular? Huh. There's got to be something unpopular that should be popular.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it feels tedious to say something to do with gender because we've literally just talked about that for over an hour. Something unpopular that should be popular. My God, my brain has frozen. This is
You
terrifying.
can stick,
Normally I can.
you can stick it to gender. I mean, that'll be fit the theme of the.
Um, yeah, okay, I'll try this. Let's see how this goes. Um, being honest about sex differences. It's very unpopular, and it's unpopular in lots of different ways for different groups of people. So feminists have very long and painful history with people using sex differences as an argument for saying that women are inferior. And a lot of the time they invent sex differences. Like, it used to be, oh, women have smaller brains, as they must be more stupid. Women can't think because their uterus takes all the blood, this sort of shite. So it's very hard to get a feminist to accept a genuine sex difference argument. And then there's other people who don't want to hear about sex differences. So employers would be a big example. Like, as soon as you think about the modern capitalist market economy, it's really hard, genuinely hard, to see how you incorporate the people who make the babies in that sort of atomized market situation where you're paying for work. You're not paying people, you're paying for the work. Women are actually a big problem for a system that was set up for men. And then there's people who do like talking about sex differences, namely conservatives, like small c conservatives, especially Christian ones, who believe that it's God-given. But I think they talk about them the wrong way. They think about them as a hierarchy. The man is the head of the household, only men can be priests, women are helpmeets, that sort of thing. But talking about genuine sex differences is the only way that we can build a world that's fit for humans. Because there are genuine sex differences, and it's not just that women are the ones who have the babies, and it's not just that women are physically smaller and weaker. There are quite meaningful, obviously just on average, differences in emotional regulation, in mental and intellectual strengths and weaknesses, and also in inclinations, so preferences for jobs and so on. And those things are barely talked about because people think that what you're saying is women are inferior. But if you don't talk about them and don't accept them, then what you're doing is you're saying that anything where a woman is different from a man, the woman has to be inferior from the man. The man becomes the default human and the woman becomes the deviation from it. And we end up with a world that is only suitable for men. And that's not good for men either, because not all men are just standard men, men vary too. So I'll give you an example. In academia, everybody knows the career path is completely unsuitable for women. It takes you so long to get your first postdoc position and then your first teaching position or lecturing position that you're already well into your 30s. But you have to then establish yourself with a publication record. And by the time you've done that, you're probably really, really struggling to push out a few babies or even one baby. And so they've introduced policies that are meant to try and make that easier. But in fact, what those policies have done is generally give men more leave when their partners have babies that the men then use to write papers and get tenure. Because nobody's talking honestly about it. And I don't have a solution to these things. They're hard. It's genuinely hard to know what to do about the fact that we have, half of us are the ones who have to make the next generation and the other half have no real role in that past the conception. But if we don't accept that the sexes are different and want somewhat different things and need somewhat different things and have different vulnerabilities and strengths, then we can't actually build a world that's a good world for all of us. And that's a good world for families, it's a good world for children. And that's where we are at the moment. So there you go, thinking about sex differences. That's my unpopular thing that I'd like to make popular.
I think that's really well said. I think it is really difficult. I think maybe for my generation, maybe a bit younger, I think there is a real there are serious issues in terms of defining the role of boys and men and women and girls. And I think that's one of the reasons you see so many people more single ever before in terms of current generation. They're not even looking for partners, a lot of people, because I think there is a serious issue in terms of not identity, but I think this is just a real divide in terms of what to do career path. So I think it's an interesting one. I think a lot of people.
Yeah, actually, you're making me sort of want to add to it a little bit. I mean, completely, I didn't say anything about what kids think or what teenagers want or what young adults want, but we're seeing strong divergence between expectations and tastes and politics of the sexes, much more than there used to be, and much less willingness to think of accommodating to the other. And The talk of toxic masculinity, like there really is toxic masculinity. That phrase means something. But a lot of people use it to mean that masculinity itself is toxic. And it's not. I mean, lots of the things that are within classic masculinity are actually very good things. Bravery and strength and standing up for people who are physically weaker than yourself and so on. And it's fine if you're not masculine too. That's grand. Not all men have to be masculine. And then femininity, like femininity can mean nurturing. It can mean being very brave, like, standing up for children, for younger women. There's lots of good things about it too, but there's a toxic femininity as well. And when you're not honest about the fact that most people are fairly stereotypically like their sex, but not entirely, nobody knows what to be. Nobody knows what it is to be a good man or a good woman. Obviously, there's many different ways to be good. But you know what I mean? Like, there's no guides, no role models, no understanding that, if you're just a very, very ordinarily masculine or feminine person, that's fine. Fine, fine, fine. And so then how are the two sexes to get together and make babies and live happily together like most of us want to, when there's so little understanding across the divide and actually a lot of contempt?
And I think there's almost a push to try and make them the same. Like you're seeing a lot
Yes.
of the features, and you're seeing men. Again, it used to be different types of men, but I think you're seeing more men becoming almost feminized and women becoming more masculine. I just think that they're almost morphing into the same person, and it's just, yeah, I think.
But I wouldn't mind if that's natural. Like, there's a lot to be said for being fairly androgynous,
Yeah.
like just leaning into whatever it is that you want to be. It's more that, looking at, I mean, I hear this a lot because I talk to teenagers and young adults because I'm trying to understand what they think about gender stuff. But it's striking how often the boys will say the girls are all crazy, like really crazy. The boys will say, all they care about is the rainbow bullshit. And then if you talk to the girls, they'll say, boys are just all crazy, that they're all listening to Andrew Tate. And, it's like boys and girls did always like somewhat different things, but that was kind of understood and accepted. It was okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it would be fine if a particular boy or girl didn't like the things that is normal for their sex. That's grand. I'm not saying that. Just to have contempt for people. I do have contempt for Andrew Tate, I should say. But just, that's a stereotype. Loads of boys don't like Andrew Tate. That's just writing them all off. Loads of girls don't go for the gender bullshit. But yes, anyway, so there's a very contemptuous and distant attitude, and the two groups siloing themselves in online communities. They're separated much, much more. Girls and boys spend a lot less time together than they used to. It's just in school, and then outside that, they're going their own way in terms of what they watch, think, read, talk about, the social media spaces and so on. And it leaves them very ignorant about each other and quite easy to develop contempt for each other.
Well, I think it's a really interesting way to end. Thank you so much for your time, Helen. It's been amazing speaking to you.
Oh, thank you for letting me talk at high speed, at length, in response to perfectly short questions. It's been fun for me too.
Thank you, Helen. I've just stopped the recording. That was awesome. Thank you so much. That was so good.
Great. Thank you for having me on. I know I've got to wait until